Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my Round 8 game from the St. Louis Norm Invitational. Now, if you followed the Round 7 video, you know this tournament has just been an unmitigated disaster. I've have a half point out of 7. I did get a draw in Round 6, but then I promptly lost again in Round 7. And actually, this Round 8 game was played on May 20th, which happens to be my birthday. So I was in a position where I was having the worst tournament of my life in a place in St. Louis where, respectfully, I'd never been before in my life in Missouri, away from friends and family, and just having an awful time of it. So it was really a very, very strange and surreal moment in a bad way. I just had to kind of finish the tournament, and, there were 2 rounds to go, and I was trying to put my best foot forward. But inside, I was just crying inside. It was really, really tough to go through it. And I was just trying to stay positive and stay strong. And it was nice the morning of my birthday to get a lot of messages from various people just, in and out of chess that were just like, happy birthday, keep your head up, so on and so forth. And, just staying positive through adversity is something that's really, really important because we all go through it in a variety of ways. And frankly, chess is just a game, but I pour so much passion and energy into it that it was tough to suffer as many losses as I did. Anyways, in Round 8, I was playing another strong opponent, this time Grandmaster Denis Boros, originally from Hungary, but has been living in the United States for some time because he pursued a master's degree at Webster University, and I believe now he's also in addition to being a player, he also coaches quite a bit and does some news-related stories. He's quite known in the American chess community, and he's a really nice guy. Of course, he was an opponent today. Now, I was white, and I was trying to sort of press him a little bit. I'd had some experience playing with him in the past, and I thought those games went pretty well. So, I was just trying to go for it. So, I opened with d4. Denis played knight f6. I went c4, and now c5. And c5 was somewhat of a surprise to me because I didn't think it was necessarily in his main repertoire. I expected a Queen's Gambit declined with e6 and d5 or something along those lines. And so c5 told me he was kind of spoiling for a fight. And it's not a huge surprise that, someone would be spoiling for a fight in a situation where I've lost nearly every fight I've participated in. So it made a lot of sense that he was trying to get a dynamic position because as shaky as I was playing, that sort of made sense. I played d5, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, and d6. And basically now the question, because the center is not quite fixed yet, but I do have this pawn mass in the center, and he set up with a fianchetto on the king side, which is kind of signaling like a King's Indian type of formation, except that because he's played the pawn move to c5 instead of the pawn to e5, it's actually more along the lines of a Benoni. And so the question for me was whether or not he was going to play with e6 or whether he's going to leave the pawn on e7 because there are implications to that. If he plays with e6, then typically you take on e takes d5 next, and then we have a Benoni type of structure that happens where if I play c takes d5, the pawn structure is quite unbalanced, and black has a queenside pawn majority, but I have a pawn mass in the center that's quite dangerous, and the space advantage favors white. The safer approach is after e6 and e takes d5, I can also take with the e pawn and keep the center symmetrical, or at least keep the pawn structure symmetrical. But, black should be okay there, and it's tough for white to really have any serious edge there, although it is a way to get like a slight advantage. The other way is to not play e6 at all. So if black wanted to, I've seen this before, they can go like knight a6, knight c7, rook b8, a6, and b5, and essentially prepare the b5 break best they can, and leave the pawn on e7, and just allow the bishop on this long diagonal to exert some pressure. Now, white can preempt that. They can try to play a4 to restrict b5, and, the bishop is lined up against this b5 square, and so are the knight and the pawn on c4. And I know these arrows might be a little bit dizzying, but I'm just trying to illustrate what those types of plans could look like. So I was already thinking, what kind of course of action would he take? Because I can't really stop him from going for whatever plan he wants to go for. I just have to respond correctly when he chooses a path. So I went bishop d3. This is actually a move that happens in this line when you have Benoni's. The point is that if they go e6, you actually want the bishop on d3 to kind of support the e4 pawn, and it's actually pretty well placed there, as opposed to e2, which is normally where the bishop tends to end up in the Benoni. This is like a modern, better treatment, better version. So after bishop d3, e6 was played, and I went knight f3. And I'm actually kind of inviting this Benoni structure where after e takes d5, I can go c takes d5 or e takes d5. Either one is viable. After knight f3, castles was played, and I castled. And now black went for knight a6. And knight a6 kind of keeps all the cards open, because if you recall a moment ago, I said that black could play for knight a6, knight c7, and then play for b5. Or black could play e takes d5 and play for this, Benoni type of structure with the e file open. Or they can, even sometimes just kind of wait and make a few more waiting moves. And knight a6 is very multi-purpose in the standpoint that he's not committed to what the pawn structure is going to look like. Note that me taking on e6 is not particularly desirable, because after bishop takes e6, black's actually quite active here, and even though you might say, well, doesn't black have like a backward d6 pawn? Well, it actually turns out it's very, very difficult to attack, and in return for that pawn, black has really good counterplay on the diagonal, and this bishop on e6 is quite well placed, and I helped it develop. So it's really, really quite a playable position. So instead, after knight a6, I decide to go h3, which kind of cuts out one of the other plans that black typically goes for in the Benoni, which is that instead, if I back up, instead of, let's say, knight a6, if they went e takes d5 and c takes d5, a lot of times what happens is a6, a4, and then bishop g4. And believe it or not, in a lot of these Benoni positions, black's actually willing to jettison that light squared bishop, because a lot of times it struggles to find activity in front of this wall of white pawns in the center. So you essentially trade that knight on f3 that white had, and you secure more control over an important dark square in the center. And a lot of times that's what the Benoni looks like. You play with the dark squares because you have this monster dark squared bishop. So my idea with h3 is, because now that black essentially decided to play knight a6 and keep the cards open, I was like, well, if it does turn to Benoni, now the bishop doesn't actually have the g4 square to pin my knight on f3. So after h3, I thought, okay, this is going to be a really good version of a Benoni, because if e takes d5, I can go c takes d5, and this bishop on c8 is kind of not so great, and, well, if the knight harasses me, I can just go to bishop b1 and then challenge it next with a3. And I thought, okay, this is pretty good, right? Well, it is, but it actually turned out Denny's had a different idea in mind, and it was actually quite savvy move order. He actually now went for the move knight c7 first, which actually kind of keeps the tension even longer. So the point is that he's eyeing the d5 pawn. He's not committed to taking here, and he's just keeping the tension a bit longer, which is a kind of cagey decision. So it's kind of a clever and nuanced way to kind of ask white what he's doing. After knight c7, I went rook e1, which is, again, another normal move you see in the Benoni. So if e takes d5 now, after c takes d5, my rook is already well supported on the e file, supporting the e4 pawn. And in some lines, my bishop might dart back to f1, where it might be more secure. And so really, really nice prophylactic move, rook e1, and just a general useful move. And here, actually, this is the move that really, really I thought was savvy, because it was worked in conjunction with the rest of his moves, was the move e5. And on the face of it, e5 is not a move that the computer is going to love at all. It's not close to the best move or anything like that. But it's really savvy because of, in one fell swoop, he's closed the position and changed the character of the structure in a way that changes the implications completely. So my last few moves, rook e1 and h3, essentially anticipated an open structure, and all of a sudden it's closed, and these moves h3 and rook e1, there has to be real debate over whether they were useful or not. Because now that the position is closed, and this takes on the character of a King's Indian, where, f5 is usually in the cards, this h3 move might actually be a hook for Black's pawn storm on the king side. The other thing is this rook on e1, is not really covering the f2 pawn, which might actually be a factor because now this e-file is going to be closed for quite some time. So the point is that with the moves knight a6 and knight c7, Black actually did something kind of useful, whereas h3 and rook e1 for me probably weren't. Now that's the kind of plus side for Black. The downside is that in general the knight on c7 isn't particularly well placed because it doesn't have access towards the center, and it's really merely potentially supporting a b5 break, but it's fairly unrealistic to expect b5 to be accomplished because I have so many pieces on that square. So this knight's actually on c7 is quite questionable. The other thing is that white does have a space advantage. And space matters. So at the end of the day, Black is going to need to be quite aggressive on the king side to justify the lack of space in the center. And last but not least, the queen side is a potential opportunity for white to get off a pawn storm with a3 and b4 and try to rush on the queen side, where Black tries to play on the king side. So it's a very, very dynamic game. And, it's interesting to compare these positions to the King's Indian because, again, the King's Indian, this c5 pawn would be on c7, and this knight on c7 now would probably be on d7 coming through b8. So thinking about the pros and cons of each are, quite important. But I would say that the position is definitely better for white, but extremely dynamic and complicated. And we're going to see a little bit more of why that's the case later. So after e5, I went a3. I recognized that now it's kind of a race because Black is going to play on the king side, and I've got to play on the queen side. That's where my counterplay is going to come from. So I'm trying to get a3 and b4 to open up the b file and get some counterplay on that flank. After a3, b6 was played. That's a good move, normal move in these structures to reinforce the c5 pawn. And now I went for b4 anyway. And now Black went knight a6. And this is another pretty reasonable move, and it actually gives the knight on a6 quite a purpose, because now if I want to take on c5, that wouldn't be very desirable because this knight would have a lovely outpost on the c5 square, where it would eye my center, eye my bishop on d3, and also kind of slow down whatever pawn storm I was envisioning on the queen side. So really, really, good square for the knight. The bad thing about it is that it's not really entering the game. It's just going to be purely defensive there, but it does slow down my initiative. And the question you always have to ask here is, do you want to actually rush with b5? Because if white actually plays b5, sure, white has all the space in the world and can go for a4 and a5. But the point is that is it going to be sort of like decisive space advantage when Black is actually going to wind up attacking your king on the king side? So that's always the tug of war in these King's Indian type of structures, is that white is better. At least the computer is going to give white like a +1 advantage, which in computer speak is nearly winning. But the challenge is really executing the attack or executing your play, because the attack on the king side is really, really scary in a practical game to deal with. And one of the other things that can happen a lot is the computer evaluates a lot based on space. So it just sees all the space and it says, oh, white is better because it has all this space. But in actuality, if the position is closed, it can be quite difficult to take advantage of that space. So this is the other sort of tension about closing the centers, because if I go b5 and now Black goes for a move like a5, it actually appears like Black is completely locked up the queen side, and the only way I can try to keep it open would be b takes a6. But after knight takes a6, it's actually really hard to continue the initiative. This knight will come to b4 and kind of be a nice blocker and anchor. And another actual way to, actually slow things down would even just be rook takes a6. And, black is going to say, hey, I recognize that you're better on the queen side, but how significant is it really if my king isn't over there and we're going to just wind up trading these pawns anyway? Like, you might have space, but who cares if there's nothing really to operate with? So this is the tension you have to sort of keep in mind when playing these structures. So because of that, after knight a6, I elected not to close the center and instead went for rook b1, which I thought was a little bit more responsible because it allows me to keep the tension. This is positive pawn tension for me. Obviously, black's not going to take and help me, secure this this duo to advance with c5. So, and in the meantime, I'd say, you know what? I might take on c5 at some point. I might play b5. Remains to be seen. I'm keeping my options open. And flexibility can be a really, really important asset in these types of structures because, again, if you commit to closing the center too quickly, or excuse me, the flank too quickly, you might get overrun on the other side of the board. So anyways, after rook b1, black now went knight h5. That's fairly logical move, trying to, get an f5. And this is actually probably a critical position of the game, the first really critical position. Because the question is, all right, I have this pawn tension on b4 and c5, but I probably don't want to play b5 because it slows down my play on that side. On the flip side, black is trying to play f5, f4, and get this checkmating attack going on the king side that we see in so many King's Indians. And so the question is, how do I get my own play going if it would, because it appears that I can't really push my pawns right now favorably. So there are a few different options, and again, the computer here will give +1 in almost every line, but I want to give you an idea of the different plans that white can go for in this structure. So one idea is to play bishop at g5, and the point is to actually challenge the queen on d8 with tempo, and after f6, which is the natural move to kick the bishop away, to dart back to e3. And the point is with this transaction, you manage to develop your bishop and get closer to connecting your rooks, and you're still keeping the tension in the position. And you're arguing that f5 isn't really a danger to you, because if f5 is played, there's actually e takes f5, g takes e5, and bishop g5 back. And the point is now you can't challenge this bishop on with any pawn, so the queen has to move. And after the queen moves, you try to attack something else. And so you play like knight b5 to d6, attacks the d6 pawn. And after e4, there's some crazy lines where knight h4 is super strong, pinning the pawn to the queen. And then after bishop e5, which continues to block this and reinforce the threat of e takes d3, white actually has the move queen d2, strangely enough. And the point is that e takes d3 is not possible because of f4, among other things. And after queen d7, white can actually play f4 anyway and challenge this bishop and just get a fine position, because now if the bishop drops back, this one will dart back to e2, and white has kind of stymied black's pawn pushes. And these pawns might be actually weaknesses more than they are strengths, because white might have this lever with g4. So the point with this line, I think, is to illustrate that when f5 comes, it's not always particularly dangerous, because a lot of times you can actually play e takes f5 and open up the position and actually attack that pawn mass, those almost hanging pawns, as you call them. And so that's one way to handle the position, where you just kind of invite f5 and you continue to develop your pieces. Another way is to play bishop c2. And the idea with this line is actually to reroute this bishop through a4 to the queen side, believe it or not, and try to get some initiative on the queen side pawns. So just to illustrate what that would look like, first and foremost, I had to recognize that f5 actually isn't a threat here. Because if you play f5 here and you recapture with the g-pawn, this knight on h5 is actually hanging. So there are actually lines where e takes f5, g takes f5, and then knight g5 is a good move, but even knight takes e5 is an awesome tactic, taking advantage of the h5 knight. And after a move like bishop takes d5, you can see my knight on c3 is hanging, but I can actually just play the exchange sacrifice rook takes e5. And after d takes and queen takes, it's actually white here that's totally winning, believe it or not, because white has a pawn for the exchange and really good bishops that are just pointing at the king side. That's actually extremely airy right now that these pawns have been pushed. Not to mention the fact that the knight on a6 is really passive, and white has a protected passed pawn. But even if that exchange sacrifice isn't your cup of tea, then knight on h5 is hanging again, so I can even go for knight g5, which the computer actually evaluates as even better than knight takes e5, because another idea in King's Indians a lot is once the f-pawn moves to get that knight into this juicy e6 square. And so if the knight goes back to f6, after knight e6, the position's actually winning, because after bishop takes e6 and d takes e6, the queen and rook have to worry about this e7 pawn being a factor, and the light squares are porous after this exchange, and black's light squared bishop is gone, and already there's just weaknesses that can really be taken advantage of right away. f5 is a huge target, and the only way to defend that reasonably is actually e4. And here, there's so many moves that can rip open this chain. f3 is one that works. Knight d5 is one that works. But one that the computer shows, which I think just illustrates just how bad the position is the beautiful move g4, which rips it open even at the cost of your king side. The point is that after f takes g4, knight takes e4, and g takes h3, queen d3, and all of a sudden the bishop and queen battery on h7 is menacing. If these knights get traded, e7 is also a threat, forking the queen and rook because the rook on e1 supports it. And even this rook on b1 can sometimes transfer to g3 via the b3 square. So it just goes to show you that the light squares are really sensitive if you're managed to stick that knight on e6. And the point in this line with bishop c2, again, is to entertain playing the bishop towards the queen side, but also acknowledge that f5 isn't really a threat yet because the knight is hanging all the time. Another thing to point out is that if instead of taking with the g-pawn, you take with the piece, well, now after rook takes f5, actually have g4, which forks the two pieces. And long term, the knight has this lovely e4 square, which is a nice blockading square from which it can control really important squares on the king side and the pawn on d6. So in a lot of circumstances, if black decides to recapture an f5 with a piece, that e4 square is forever white's. Whereas after g takes f5, white has to play against the hanging pawns. Last but not least, just to get back to the bishop a4 idea, let's say f5 isn't played and bishop d7 is played. Well, the idea is actually bishop a4, trying to challenge this bishop on d7. Remember, if the light squared bishop of blacks is traded, it's usually very difficult to execute the kingside pawn storm because a lot of times the break happens on g4, on the g4 square, and if it's not well supported, it's difficult to execute. So actually, this trade of these bishops actually favors white. So trading these bishops is actually quite good, and then just kind of securing things. Again, we saw f5 is not necessarily a great move because of knight g5 jumping into e6. So there were a number of plans to kind of deal with this f5 move and to kind of play around black's pawns. And the point is that the computer thinks all of them are good, but in practice, the attack can be very scary to deal with. And so I was thinking, okay, obviously f5 might not be a move right away, but it certainly may be a move in the future. And so I had to be very wary of this break. And one way sometimes that f5 is actually facilitated is sometimes black goes for queen e8. And the point is that after f5 and g takes f5, the queen's actually protecting the knight on h5. So keep that maneuver in mind because it's something that you might actually wind up seeing. Anyways, I elected to play knight b5, and this was my way to kind of get my counterplay going. My thought process was, by putting the knight on b5, I freeze this queen on d8. So it actually can't go to e8 to support the knight on h5 because the d6 pawn is hanging. So I actually acknowledged or recognized that f5 was not possible, and I thought by putting the knight on b5, I kind of tie up his pieces. And so that was my plan. But it maybe wasn't the best plan, but it was a good plan, and white is still a great deal better here. After knight b5, black went king h8. So black recognizes that f5 isn't a move just yet and makes a move that is, in general, a good King's Indian type of move. Because in a lot of lines, when f5, f4 is coming with g5, a lot of times you want the rook to wind up going to the g file and pressing down that line. So this kind of is a long-term preparation of that plan. I now went for the move bishop g5, challenging this queen on d8, and the point is now it can't move away because of knight takes d6. So f6 I thought wouldn't be played, but queen d7 was played instead. But the point is that if f6, I'll just go bishop d2 back. And again, you can see I'm kind of combining the plans we talked about. I'm putting my knight on b5. I'm getting closer to connecting my rooks, but provoking weaknesses, and just kind of making things difficult for black. To me, queen d7 was a huge victory because the queen seemed very awkward there. It's blocking the bishop on c8 from developing, and it just seemed wrong. And the more I looked at the position, the more I got excited because I saw the move bishop c2. And this move is extremely strong because now my bishop is trying to go to a4, where all of a sudden I have all kinds of discoveries which would uncover the bishop on the queen. So it would seem that actually when we paused the video and we looked at, or we didn't pause the video, but when we went to that critical position and looked at all the various plans you had in the King's Indian structure and the closed structure, I kind of managed to get a combination of all of them. I got my bishop to g5. I played my knight to b5 to, target this pawn. And I even was able to reroute the bishop to a4 potentially. So really, really, I thought it was great that I combined all these plans. And the computer agreed because it actually evaluated my position as winning here. And that's the kind of funny thing about the King's Indian is, again, the computer will give these really, really sort of inflated evaluations, I would say. Not inflated because they're wrong necessarily, but inflated because it does not take into account black's counterplay and just the precision that is required for white to not mess up this position. Because, again, at any moment, f5 could come and it can be very, very dangerous for white's king all of a sudden. But I did do quite well to get to this point because f5 is still not in the cards because the knight on h5 is loose. So after bishop c2, f6 was actually played, kicking my bishop away. And I went bishop d2. I didn't want it to be on e3 because I thought maybe f5, f4 could come with tempo at some point. So I thought bishop d2 was better. And now queen e7 was played just to secure the queen on a square where it's not going to be harassed by the light squared bishop. And now I went for the move king h2. And this was actually a step in the wrong direction, but I think kind of illustrates the human element of playing these types of positions. Because now that the queen was on e7, I was legitimately concerned about f5. I shouldn't have been, but I was. Why was I concerned? Well, I was concerned for a few reasons. One, because f5, f4 is something that we talked about was scary. The other thing I was a little bit worried about was in some lines the knight may be coming to f4. And from f4, I thought it was eyeing h3 and g2 with this bishop on c8. And I thought, you know what? King h2 covers the h3 pawn. It overprotects it so that there wouldn't be any sacrifices on that square. A better move, though, would have been bishop a4. And this is something that the computer is uniquely equipped to do, is just to ignore the incoming threats or challenges of an attack, because it's just not a very human move. The line that the computer gives after bishop a4 is f5, knight c3 back, just allowing f4. And after f4, going bishop c6. And again, this was the move. This was the idea I originally had with bishop c2, is to go a4 c6. But it's just so hard to ignore the pawn roller on the king side. And after rook b8, the computer actually wants queen a4, moving your queen far away from the king side to get some kind of gain on the queen side with b5 and queen takes a7. And it works, but after g5, b5, knight c7, queen takes a7, and g4, is this really a position that you want to play with your queen completely stranded from the king and all of a sudden all these pieces just converging at once? This is the type of thing that's very, very difficult for the human to do and for the human to stomach, frankly. And I just wasn't able to kind of stomach that. So I wanted to go for something where I kept my advantage but did not allow all of that counterplay. So another way to actually deal with the position besides playing king h2 after bishop a4 and f5 would have actually been to, in some lines, to actually go for the move rook b3, believe it or not. And the point is, with rook b3, I actually can kind of defend the third rank horizontally and preempt any g4 breaks on the third rank. So that was another way to play that I could have considered. But after I went for king h2. So it is what it is. But again, I think it gives you a sense of why these positions are so tricky, because that white is better, but black always has this potential attack, and it can come very fast. So after king h2, black went knight f4, and I think this is another point, a thing that's important to point out, is that bishop takes f4 is an option, but it's actually kind of undesirable. And the reason it's undesirable is because once e takes f4 is played, this bishop all of a sudden has the potential to open up on that diagonal again one day. And the prospect of that is not something I was encouraged by. Not to mention the fact that just giving up the two bishops in general is never really a stellar idea. And last but not least, after that trade, again, g5, h5, and g4 could be a very, very quick and sudden steamroller. And so I did not want to have a pawn here to serve as an anchor for that steamroller. But you could see why I went king h2 now, because after knight f4, I was worried about the storm cloud brewing on my pawns. After knight f4, I went knight g1, and again, it's another one of these defensive moves, kind of acknowledging that black has pressure, whereas the computer would just kind of ignore it and say, well, there's nothing there. And so the computer actually wants you to play knight c3, and the point is that if f5 is played now, the knight is already pretty well placed to kind of deal with that e4 square. So after e takes f5, bishop takes f5 is actually forced because there's actually a problem on this file with bishop takes f4. So g takes f5 was impossible because white would actually just win a piece because of this pin. In this version, after bishop takes f5, bishop takes f4 does not work because of bishop takes c2, which attacks the queen, and then black can recapture with the rook on f4. So in this line, after bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5, rook takes f5. Now the knight could jump into e4 and kind of replace the pawn that was there. And here white has an advantage because of the wonderful blockade on the e5 pawn and this really nice centralized knight. And so this is another version of a white advantage in a King's Indian, where you actually just have this awesome blockade and you have really good pieces now in the middle to control black's activity. So we've seen a few examples. We've seen the hanging pawns example where they play g takes f5. We've seen an example where they take on f5 with a piece and then the knight blockades. And we've also seen an example where black just plays f4, f5, and then f4, and you just ignore it and you play on the queen side. And the challenge, again, in these positions is to kind of judge which type of plan you should allow and or tolerate and which one is going to actually work. So I had to wrestle with all these during the game because it's tough to judge. And knight c3 back is also a very tough move to make when you played knight b5 with the intention to put pressure on d6. So it's just a tough move to make to retreat like that. So anyways, I went knight g1. black went queen d7 now, I felt like knight g1 kind of was justified after queen d7 because now there are 3 pieces eyeing the h3 pawn. So I did feel like knight g1 was reasonably justified. I went rook b3 now, which I thought was a great move, defending the h3 pawn horizontally and potentially entertaining doubling on the b file one day. The one issue with rook b3, though, is that my bishop that I talked about getting to a4 now is not really getting there in a timely fashion. So you could see how, again, and I sound like a broken record, but the initiative that black was trying to play with on the king side distracted me sufficiently where I changed course a little bit to deal with it. After rook b3, knight c7 was played, and I played b takes c5, and this is actually, I thought, a great move because now he can't actually recapture with a knight like he was potentially doing earlier, but it's actually a mistake because I should have actually kept the tension. And a better move instead of b takes c5 would have been knight c3, just moving the knight away from the trade. Again, getting the knight prepared to assume the e4 square if f5 is played. And in general, just making the knight on c7 a really silly piece because it doesn't have any immediate prospects. So my knight on c3 is actually a better piece, and I shouldn't have been so eager to trade it. Now, I was excited to trade it or eager to trade it because I thought after b takes c5 and then b takes c5, I was getting the appropriate play on the b file. So I thought, well, black is playing on the king side, I get my play on the queen side, and I thought I was fast now. But actually turns out that trading the knight kind of hurt my defensive task on the king side. And it's actually surprisingly difficult to break through here, which we'll see. So after queen takes c7, I went knight e2, trying to get rid of this knight on f4 that had been bothering me for some time. And this is also another mistake. A better move would have been g3, kicking the knight away from the square with a pawn. And then after knight h5, black has the same problem that it had before with the knight on h5, where after f5, you can't actually recapture with the pawn because the knight is actually hanging. Now, I was reluctant to play g3 because it looks like I'm weakening my kingside pawns and creating a hook. And I think it kind of just illustrates, again, that the computer is more willing to play these types of positions because it is a calculating beast and just understands that if there isn't mate, there's no problem. Whereas for a human, it's like, well, sure, I might have kicked the knight away for now, but am I really going to be comfortable with the structure in the long term? Probably not. And so that was the rationale I made. So after knight e2, knight takes e2 was played, queen takes e2, and now f5 was played. And this is actually the problem is before, when there were more minor pieces on the board, the knight was actually getting in the way of this f5 break all the time. Whereas now that the knight is gone, f5 is easily accomplished, and, all of black's pieces are kind of ready and primed for it, whereas before they weren't. The other thing is that by trading some of those pieces, I didn't actually get my own play off on the queen side. So I released a lot of tension, and it was kind of a questionable decision because it allowed black to not have to worry about as many things. So those tensions, like with the pawn on c5 and then the knight on c3, they were actually helping me, not hurting me. So after f5, I went rook eb1, just kind of ignoring that. I thought now playing against the hanging pawns with f4 wouldn't have been such a brilliant idea because I thought after e4 this would be a really good diagonal for black. And I thought the rook coming to g8 would get some counterplay. But even here, white actually has an advantage, and white could have considered playing this way because now this bishop on c8 is actually shut out of any pressure on my king side. So this could have actually been considered. And then the flip side is that if you keep the tension on this position and you don't push, at some moment white may take, or they might still keep the tension because this bishop on c8 is shut out of the game. So f4 was a move that should have garnered more serious consideration because after rook eb1, And then f4, you can see this bishop is actually playing on this diagonal, whereas before it probably wasn't. So after f4, I went bishop d1, which is a good move. Finally, I can say that. Kind of prophylactically spinning this bishop around to the diagonal where these pawns might potentially storm. And then bishop f6 was played. Bishop f6 is a very, very good move, and a move I just totally underestimated. I did not understand the follow-up. I thought in this position that the dark square bishop was just going to be a dead piece for a long time. But this move starts a maneuver that is really, really powerful and makes sure that the bishop is going to be playing in the game. I now went queen d3, trying to swing my queen towards the queen side, but this move kind of ignores what black's idea was with bishop f6, and it was the move bishop h4. And this move is incredibly strong because the issue is here that I never really want to play f3 because then the bishop can kind of anchor itself on g3 and be a really, really powerful piece and kind of spearhead a potential mating attack where after g5 and rook f6 and rook h6, there can be potential sacrifices on h3 where if the queen lands here, there might be an eventual mate on f2. So this bishop on h4 and potentially g3 is just a super, super strong piece. And I just kind of underestimated that the bishop can sit here and I'm a f2 pawn, which is very, very annoying. I went king g1 to defend that pawn, and now black went h5, and you can see the initiative here on the king side is in full effect. And the question is, am I going to break through on the queen side in time, and is it going to be a factor? The issue in this position is that my entry squares right now are actually covered. So b8 is covered, b7 is covered, b6 is covered, and I need one of these squares to open up to get some kind of counterplay. After h5, I went rook b5, and the idea there was to try and swing my queen around to get a third piece on the file as like an Alekhein's gun to get pressure on the b file. Black now went queen f7, good move, trying to prepare g5. Note that black could not play g5 before because the bishop was actually eyeing the h5 pawn. And now I went rook b8. Finally, I had a square available on the file, and I thought I did not want to waste that opportunity, so I played rook b8. And black actually played bishop a6, which really, really surprised me. I didn't realize that black could kind of trade a pair of rooks and still control all the entry squares. And so I played rook takes a8, but after rook takes a8, you see the entry squares are still controlled, and black is making some serious gains on this side of the board. So something kind of went wrong for me. And I think part of it is that I just allowed the steamroller f5, f4. I probably should have played e takes f5 at some point and challenged with the hanging pawns as opposed to just allowing him to get the steamrolling, to get the closed center essentially, or the closed attack. I think in general, based upon this game, I can kind of say that the easier way to play the white side of the King's Indian is to either play against the hanging pawns or to get like the knight g5, knight e6 strategy. The computer will be totally comfortable playing the closed, allowing the steamroll on the king side. But again, that's because the computer's a calculating beast and will, be able to see if it's mate or not, and if it's not mate, just ignore it. Where the human will have a much harder time doing that. So for all you King's Indian, all the white players playing against the King's Indian, consider not allowing the f5 move. Consider playing against the hanging pawns with e takes f5. Anyways, after rook takes a8, I went bishop a4, kind of in desperation, trying to swing my pieces towards that side of the board. One thing that I noticed, and this gave me great, consternation, is that I always want to go queen c3 and queen a5, and I thought if my queen gets into this side, it's pretty good. But the problem is that with this bishop on a6, it's actually attacking the c4 pawn, so if I go for that maneuver, I'm leaving the protection of that pawn, and also leaving the protection of my king side. So that was actually the problem, is it was hard to build up on the b file even though I have control of it, because I have my own things to be worried about now. So after rook takes a8, I went bishop a4, rook f8 back, and now bishop b5, trying to trade these bishops so that my queen could swing over. Bishop c6, bishop c8 was played, good move, helping to facilitate a g5, g4 break. And now I went f3, and this was kind of like a sad realization that whatever I was trying to do on the queen side didn't work, because now g5 and g4 is coming, and there's no way to stop it. And f3 basically says, I'm going to try and run my way out of there. So after f3, g5 was played. I went king f1, g4, and the steamroller is on. And I went h takes g4 to just have the potential of getting a rook to h1. And after h takes g4, I went king e2, trying to evacuate this king towards the queen side. But you can see this is not what I wanted. And it's kind of ironic in some ways, because in the King's Indian, it's normally white that has all the space. And now you can see black is taking all the space on the king side. So black's actually better. After king e2, king g7 was played, but that's actually not the best move. Better would have been g takes f3 check. And the point is that after queen takes f3, now you go king g7, and you've kind of messed up my pawn structure a little bit. Note that in this position, I wouldn't want to go g takes f3, because there's rook g8, for example, and this file is very, very dangerous. So that's one idea that I might be wary of. And another thing is actually just bishop g3. And this bishop is a really, really nice anchor on this square. And then it shields the king for when, if I play a check, the king goes to g7. And this bishop is just a really, really good piece here. But instead, king g7 was played, and that allowed me to play rook h1 and challenge the bishop here. And after rook h8, I had to be very, very precise here, because I need to swing my king around to get to safety, but I also need to worry about g takes f3 being a real threat, because the queen could come to h5 and also target f3 pawn. The bishop might build up on that square, so I need to be very precise. And the best move in this position was actually queen b1, believe it or not. And the point is that after queen g6, which tries to invade on g2 after g takes f3, I actually have the move king d3. And now, after an exchange on f3, the queen can't invade just yet, because of rook g1, which would pick up the black queen. So actually, snugging my king on d3, or tucking it over there, keeping it nice and snug, would have been the way to go. And queen b1 would have cleared the way for that square, while also doing the job of indirectly guarding the g2 pawn, because of that tactic that I pointed out. I recognized that my king needed to flee to d3, but I underestimated that the queen could just come in via g2 and really disturb my position. And I blundered big time with the move queen c3. Because now queen g6 was played, and all of a sudden there's a massive issue on g2. Now, after queen g6, I went king f1 trying to defend that g2 pawn, but it's just too late, because now the queen can actually come in and open the position. And note that if I went king d3 now, after g takes f3, queen g2, there's just this double attack on my rook on h1 and the pawn on f3. And again, there's no rook g1 tactic like before. So huge problem, king f1, because it meant that my king is still here, stranded on the side of the board where there's an attack. So really, really unfortunate. After king f1, black now took on f3. And I pretty much have to play queen takes f3, because now if g takes f3, queen g3 is a huge move, because it threatens queen f2 mate, and it also facilitates bishop h3 check. And, you know, these bishops are like lasers pointing at my king. So note that if bishop e1, bishop h3 check, king e2 only move, queen h2, queen g2 picking up the rook on h1. So a huge problem with my king on f1, and I'm kind of forced to play queen takes f3. And now the position is just lost because my king is stuck here. The pawn on g2 is also a major weakness now because I had to create an extra pawn island to ensure that I wasn't mated on the spot. And so now g2 is a major target, and the g4 square is particularly sensitive because I don't have, there's no pawn that was covering that square like before. So after queen takes f3, rook h5 was played, and rook h5 actually gives me a reprieve. It's not the best move. The best move in that position, I thought it was, I was surprised this wasn't played, was actually bishop g4. And I didn't actually calculate this to the end, but it just seemed like the more natural move because it challenges the queen right away, and then that facilitates f3. And it turns out that the tactics confirmed my intuition because if queen d3 is played covering the e4 pawn, the only way to cover that pawn, now f3 is just decisive. The point being that now that the king is on f1, I have huge tactical issues. So after g takes f3, bishop takes f3, and queen takes f3, there's just rook f8, which, just picks up the queen, unfortunately. And the other line is that after bishop takes f3, if you think, oh, well, doesn't rook g1 here just win black's queen? Isn't this sufficiently winning? Not so fast. Black has the very nice deflecting move, bishop e2 check. And the point is that if king takes e2, the rook on g1 is undefended, and black is up in exchange with still a very great attack. And if queen takes e2, now rook f8 check does the same thing. And the problem is the king is completely stranded, nowhere to go, and mate will follow very quickly. So that bishop g4 and f3 right away would have been decisive, and rook h5 gave me an opportunity to fight. Now, I actually didn't see why it gave me an opportunity to fight, but I just wound up playing bishop e1, and bishop e1 is not a bad move necessarily because it does try to trade some pieces and nullify the pressure. But the best move in the position, instead of bishop e1, was actually bishop a4. And we're going to see why that's the case in a moment. So anyways, bishop e1, bishop g4, challenging my queen on f3. And here I realized that I did have a tactical shot, one more chance to kind of fight. And the move was bishop e8. And this one is a really important move and very critical. And the reason it's such a critical move is because now if bishop takes f3, I go bishop takes g6, and we manage to actually trade the queens. And note that queen takes e8 doesn't work because I just play queen takes g4 check. And all of a sudden, my king is kind of still safe. And so really important that I have this bishop e8 shot, and it's actually the reason why rook h5 is a mistake. Now, the reason why I should have played bishop a4 instead of bishop e1 is because after bishop a4, if bishop g4, bishop e8, and bishop takes f3, which would be forced, I could take on g6, and then after bishop takes g2, king takes g2, king takes g6, I actually have this move king f3. And the amazing thing about this position is that it's actually completely drawn, even though black is a pawn up. And the reason for that is because of this eternal pin on the h-file. If the bishop on h4 actually moves, I actually can just trade the rooks. And the problem is, even though black is a pawn up, there's no way that black's king could get into the position and target my pawns on the queen side or in the center. So the king kind of boxes the black king out. It could only enter through h2, but then the king could just step down potentially. And then the other problem is if the king goes towards the queen side, it's the same problem where the bishop on d2 just controls the entry squares. So actually, even a pawn down, white is completely holding here. And the difference between this position and the game position is that with the bishop on e1, after this maneuver is played, black can actually go bishop takes f3, and after bishop takes g6, king takes g6, and I have to go, if g takes f3 is played now to try and preserve the pawn structure, black actually has bishop takes e1. And the point is that now black can actually trade to an endgame. So that's kind of the slight difference there, where here this position is actually losing because the king can actually walk in and get opposition. So the point is, with the bishop not on e1, with the bishop on d2, black can't actually play bishop takes e1 and transpose to that winning pawn endgame, and has to play the endgame that's a draw a pawn up. And that's actually a huge difference, because what it means is when I got to this position, I could not play g takes f3. I had to take on h4 because that endgame, that pawn endgame, is just losing. So because of that, I went rook takes h4, and my hope at salvation was an opposite colored bishops, because you could see these pawns will be captured in succession, but my hope was, well, maybe the opposite colored bishops hold. And it actually turns out they do. So after bishop takes e4, I went rook takes h5, king takes h5, and we have a position where I'm actually a pawn down, but the rest of my pawns in the center look like they're going to be picked off. And it looks like I'm in a lot of trouble, but the flip side is that all his pawns are in dark squares, so I can wheel around to c7 and start to pick those off. So we're going to have an opposite colored bishop position where I'm a pawn down, and the question is it holding or not? Is it a draw or not? And we're going to find out. So I played bishop a5. I need to very quickly spin around to c7 and attack the d6 pawn. Black played king g4, moving on in towards g3, and this already gave me quite the scare, because I thought that if king g3 is played, black can play bishop takes g2 check with tempo. And so I played king f2, and this is actually a mistake. It's not a losing mistake, but it's actually a pretty significant mistake. Instead, I should have played bishop c7 right away. And the reason for that is that if king g3 is played, I actually continue to take on d6, because if bishop takes g2 check, king g1, f3, and I actually have bishop takes e5, and this pawn is not getting to f2 before my king gets there, and this position is totally fine for white. So all of a sudden, I would be the one that'd be totally fine. So because of that, I actually should have continued with bishop takes with bishop c7 and attack the d6 pawn, because king g3 is actually not a threat. And the issue with bringing my king to f2 is that now, once this bishop actually does take one of these pawns, e4, e3 potentially comes with check. So that actually means I lose a tempo on certain positions, which is hugely important. Hugely important. And in fact, it's very, very surprising that the position isn't losing right at this moment, but I still have a chance. After king f2, black played bishop d3. That's logical. I went bishop c7, e4, bishop takes d6, e3 check, and I went here. I have another very, very critical decision to make. The question is, do I go king e1 or king g1? And right here, this kind of decides the game, that decision. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out whether I should go to e1 or g1. All right, hopefully you paused the video and got a sense of what to do. The best move in the position, and the move I did not play, unfortunately, is king g1. And the reason I didn't play this, again, was similar to the reason I played king f2 earlier. I was concerned about this king coming to g3, and then bishop e4 and bishop takes g2, just, getting two connected passed pawns and winning the game. But it turns out it's not so simple. After king g1, king g3 actually doesn't really work. And the reason for that is that after bishop takes c7, and, if bishop e4 is played, I actually can just go bishop d6. Or excuse me, I can actually go bishop... Where can I go? excuse me, I can go d6. And the point is that bishop takes g2, I can actually just go d7 and I'm threatening to queen. So there's no time for this. There's just no time. And that's actually huge because it means my king, it means that he can't actually go for the g2 pawn. So the next question is, well, if he can go for the g2 pawn right away, what about if he takes on this rest of your pawns in the middle? And I thought this position, again, would be lost because he can eventually come and challenge my g3 pawn. So after taking, bishop takes c5, bishop takes d5, I thought this position would be losing for me because of king g3, bishop takes g2. But it turns out here, white is actually drawing with a very, very precise maneuver. And the maneuver is actually bishop b4. And the point is, whenever the king comes to g3, there's bishop e1 check pushing it away. And so if king g3, bishop e1 does not work. And so the king has to try and find another way in. So let's try the king wheels around the other way and tries to go towards the middle and tries to promote the e pawn. Now you put the bishop on c7 where you're always attacking the f4 pawn, and the king just can't come closer. And the point is that if you jettison the f4 pawn and go for king d3 anyway, I take the pawn, and you can't actually advance e2 without taking away the square from which your king can actually support that pawn. So for instance, you play e2, I have king f2, and then king e1, and I blockade the pawn. And if you go king d2, the problem is that now I can actually just keep my bishop on the diagonal. And because of the pin, you can actually never push e2. And so it's very, very unusual because that you can't push the pawn because of the pin. And if you move your king out the way, you actually get in the way of pushing your pawn. So it's just a weird, weird circumstance where wherever the king goes, you can't advance. And if the king's actually supporting the queening square, you're pinned. So the position is just a draw. Tough to see from far away, but it's just a fact. And in fact, if the g2 pawn was gone, if the g2 pawn was not on the board, it's still a draw because it plays no factor right now. So that was something I should have noticed and I just missed. But it's difficult to see that from far away, that the king cannot invade because of this pin. So because of that, I made the fatal decision, absolutely fatal decision of going king e1. But after king e1, my king is actually cut off from ever defending this pawn again, and that means the g2 pawn will be lost. And so after bishop takes c4, bishop takes c7, and bishop takes d5, black does not even care about defending a7 because having two connected passed pawns is usually decisive. I took on a7, king g3 was played, really good move, and the point is that if you get the king here, you're actually also supporting the break. And now I went a4, just trying to kind of delay the position a little bit. And bishop takes g2 was played. And now I went king e2, and bishop f3 check was played, king d3, bishop e4 check, king e2, and f3 check. And I resigned. Because if king takes e3, f2 queens the pawn. Because after king e2, it looks like I've stopped it. It looks like I'm controlling f1. But bishop d3 check is a nasty tactic which deflects my king away while protecting the f1 square. And then queen happens. Now, I just want to point out that if I did defend a little bit better, if I played bishop b8 to kind of stop the pawn from pushing, this position I believe is still losing because after bishop takes g2, bishop c7, king f3, bishop b8, king e4, king c7. Well, actually, I'm not sure. This position actually might be a draw as well because the issue here is that, wow, that's incredible. No, this position is lost because the issue, I was saying that now the bishop can come to g3 potentially and stop f2 check. So the point is that if f3. Bishop g3 temporarily stops f2 because I could sack my bishop. But the problem here is that this diagonal is unfortunately too short for the bishop to save itself. So after after king f5, a4, and king g4, I can't actually contain myself on this diagonal. And if my bishop has to move away, then f2 check does win the game. So the issue is that the position, even with better defense than I gave, is lost because the diagonal from which I could sacrifice on f2 is just too short. And so the whole key in the position was to save my g2 pawn and keep my king on g1. And the position would have been drawn. And yeah, very, very, very interesting, instructive endgame. So anyways, that's it for the game. Thanks for watching. It was a very, very, very tough game. Keep in mind, it was on half point out of 8 after this loss. And of course, I also lost on my birthday, which was not a great feeling. And yeah, it is what it is. One more round to go of this nightmare event, and I was just hoping to move on. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.